Imagine the scene. It is November 28, 1979, at Auckland International Airport in New Zealand. The early morning air is filled with the roar of a McDonnell Douglas DC-10-30, designated as Air New Zealand Flight 901. Imagine the luxury inside the cabin. 237 passengers and 15 crew members settling into their seats for an elite 11-hour sightseeing loop over the frozen landscape of Antarctica. The central figure of this technical unit is Captain Thomas James Collins, a 45-year-old disciplined commander with over 11,000 flight hours. Visualize Collins and his co-pilots studying their flight maps. They're highly trained professionals executing a specialized route that promises a low-altitude pass over the spectacular Ross Ice Shelf. The power dynamic is a circuit of absolute trust in the aircraft's automated inertial navigation system. At exactly 8:17 a.m., the heavy machine climbs into the sky, heading south into the vast silence of the polar sea. The archive is open. The timeline of the total systemic sabotage of Flight 901 begins with a digital modification that no one communicated to the flight deck. Technical density expansion. The scenic flight program utilized a pre-programmed track stored in the airline's ground-based computer network. The flight crew attended a mandatory briefing where they were shown a flight path that entered the McMurdo Sound via a sea-level valley, completely unaware that a coordinate change was about to shift their vector directly toward an active volcano. The aircraft progresses smoothly for 4 hours, crossing the frozen expanse of the Southern Ocean. But behind the scenes, a critical administrative failure has already sealed the fate of the flight. The night before the departure, a technician at the Air New Zealand Navigation Office noticed an error in the digital flight plan coordinates and updated the computer track. He believed he was simply performing a routine calibration, correcting a minor 2-mile offset. However, this technical adjustment altered the flight path from a safe route over the open waters of McMurdo Sound to a trajectory that lined up directly with Mount Erebus, a 12,000-foot active volcano covered in ice. Imagine the absolute lack of warning. The new data was loaded into the plane's automated system, but the pilots were never notified of the change. They believed their display instruments were guiding them through a wide, flat valley, when in reality, the digital autopilot was steering the massive DC-10 directly toward a solid wall of rock. This is a total informational sabotage, creating a terminal disconnect between human perception and mechanical truth. Technical density expansion. The coordinate shift adjusted the longitude variable by 27 miles to the east. The flight management computer calculated the new heading flawlessly, keeping the aircraft locked onto a rigid automated path at 2,600 feet, an altitude that was safe over the sea-level sound but fatal on the new volcanic heading. The clock moves toward 12:45 p.m. As Flight 901 approaches the Antarctic coastline, Captain Collins requests permission from McMurdo station controllers to descend to 2,000 feet to give the passengers a clearer view beneath the cloud layer. The air traffic controllers approve the movement, assuming the plane is still over the open water where the altitude is safe. Imagine the scene through the cockpit windows, a vast flat expanse of brilliant white ice under a uniform sheet of gray clouds. This is the phenomenon of sector whiteout, a severe sensory sabotage unique to polar regions. Whiteout does not mean a snowstorm. It is a trick of light where the sun's rays bounce between the clouds and the snow, eliminating all shadows, contrast, and depth perception. To the eyes of the pilots, a massive mountain looks exactly like an open sky filled with distant clouds. They are staring directly at the slopes of Mount Erebus, but their brains see nothing but an empty horizontal path. The power dynamic between human sight and natural light is completely broken, blinding the crew without triggering a single panic reflex. Technical density expansion. Sector whiteout alters the scattering of light, matching the luminance of the snow-covered terrain with the overcast sky. This optical illusion prevents the human retina from detecting structural borders or distance changes, rendering the forward visibility useless for terrain avoidance, even when the air is perfectly clear of fog or precipitation. At exactly 12:49 p.m., the timeline of Flight 901 enters its final critical seconds. The aircraft is cruising at 260 knots just a few hundred feet above the snow. Suddenly, the silent cockpit is shattered by a sudden audio alarm. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, begins to scream, "Whoop, whoop, pull up. Whoop, whoop, pull up." This is the first technical indicator of imminent destruction. Imagine Captain Collins' internal panic. His eyes see nothing but white space ahead, but the computer is telling him a mountain is inches away. He reacts with instant discipline, pushing the throttles forward to full emergency power to force a steep climb. But a 300-ton airliner cannot override the laws of kinetic energy instantly. The jet engines roar, their turbines spinning to maximum velocity, but the distance is already shrunk past the safety margin. The power dynamic shifts from a pilot's control to a raw mechanical collision. Technical density expansion. The GPWS utilized a downward-directed radar altimeter that detected a sudden, vertical compression of the terrain clearance beneath the fuselage. The time window between the initial activation of the audio warning chime and the physical impact on the mountain slope was measured at exactly 6.7 seconds, a duration insufficient for the heavy Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines to generate the vertical thrust vector required to clear the ridge. The DC-10 hits the lower slopes of Mount Erebus at an elevation of 1,500 feet. The collision is a catastrophic structural explosion at 300 miles per hour. The lower fuselage is pulverized instantly against the hard glacial ice, sending a massive shockwave through the entire frame. Imagine the force of the impact shearing the wings from the body, venting thousands of gallons of jet fuel into a violent fireball that briefly stains the white landscape orange. The passenger cabin is torn into sections, a wave of kinetic energy that completely erases the structure in less than a second. This is the mechanics of absolute deletion. All 257 occupants on board suffer instantaneous death from extreme deceleration trauma. The roaring echo of the explosion bounces off the volcanic crater and fades, leaving only the sound of the 70-knot polar wind whistling through a long trail of twisted aluminum, shattered seats, and black soot scattered across the pristine white slope. Technical density expansion. The impact occurred on a 30-degree incline. The structural deceleration exceeded 100 G, causing immediate fragmentation of the aircraft's titanium spar assemblies and the complete destruction of the flight data recorder housing, although the magnetic tape inside survived the heat to preserve the final telemetry trail for the investigation teams. The investigation that followed the tragedy of Flight 901 became one of the most controversial legal and forensic battles in aviation history. The initial report by the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents blamed the flight crew, claiming that Captain Collins had acted with negligence by descending below the minimum safe altitude into a zone of poor visibility without knowing his exact location. This was an institutional attempt to close the file by placing the responsibility on dead pilots. However, a secondary Royal Commission of Inquiry, led by Justice Peter Mahone, conducted a meticulous audit of the airline's coordinate logs. Mahone uncovered the secret data change and delivered a devastating counterverdict. He accused the airline's management of an organized corporate sabotage of the truth, famously describing their defense as an orchestrated litany of lies. The court decided that the pilots were completely innocent, victims of a systemic computer error that had led them into a trap from which no human pilot could escape. Technical density expansion. Justice Mahone's forensic audit revealed that the airline's navigation computer had been updated without any entry in the official pilot logbooks, a direct violation of international civil aviation protocols. The shifting of the coordinate data changed the flight path by exactly 26 miles eastward, directly intersecting the peak of the mountain while keeping the cockpit display indicators showing a false path over the open water channel. The physical recovery operation, known as Overdue Phase 3, was an unprecedented exercise in forensic pathology under extreme polar conditions. Teams of New Zealand police officers, mountaineers, and pathologists were deployed to the slopes of Mount Erebus, working in freezing gales at 30 degrees below zero. Imagine the horror of the landscape, a black scar on the ice filled with thousands of fragmented artifacts and biological remains that had to be systematically cataloged. This was a clinical audit of human loss. The recovery workers faced severe psychological pressure, working 20-hour shifts under a sun that never set, surrounded by predatory skua birds. They recovered over 200 bodies, utilizing dental records and fingerprint analysis to restore the identities that the crash had tried to delete. The items left behind, cameras, diary entries, and clothing, were collected as a final physical rastro of the scenic loop that ended on a volcanic ridge. Technical density expansion. The preservation of the remains was aided by the low ambient temperatures, which prevented cellular degradation, but the high-velocity impact caused severe multi-fragmentary trauma that required advanced forensic anthropology models to achieve positive identification for 96% of the victims over a 4-month laboratory operation in Auckland. The final minute-by-minute forensic reconstruction of Dossier 30 ends here. 257 lives deleted by a tiny coordinate change in a computer database and an optical illusion that blinded a veteran crew, leaving a silver monument on the slopes of Antarctica. The trace left by Air New Zealand Flight 901 is a severe lesson in the critical danger of automated systems when isolated from direct human communication. The biological facts are immutable: a plane guided by invisible data, a mountain hidden in plain sight, and a legal battle that redefined the limits of corporate responsibility in aviation safety. The atmospheric guillotine remains the definitive study in human factors engineering, organizational accidents, and polar spatial disorientation. Your mind is the final piece of this investigation. Join our community of investigators by clicking the subscribe button. Help us track the traces that the ice and the corporate archives try to hide. I am your guide through the darkness, and I will return with a new dossier very soon. Keep your mind sharp. Focus on the facts with your eyes closed. And remember, every coordinate change must be verified, and every evidence counts. This is Mind 74, and we are the keepers of the cold files. The investigation is suspended, but the file remains open. Until next time. Technical density expansion. The Erebus disaster led to a complete restructuring of the global flight management briefing systems, making it mandatory for all coordinate updates to be signed off by both the navigation engineer and the commanding pilot before takeoff. The site of the crash remains a restricted zone, marked by a stainless steel cross erected on the ridge to preserve the biological profiles of the 257 victims of Flight 901.